This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. You can subscribe to the Piano Maven podcast through my Substack page by clicking on the link in the episode description. Paid subscribers get bonuses such as Piano Maven Zoom meetings, where we share listening experiences and meet special guests. So please consider subscribing to help us reach out further into the piano community and to keep this podcast in production throughout the year. I haven't done a jazz episode in a while, and I've promised some of our subscribers that I would be talking more about jazz piano on these episodes. The influence of Bill Evans on modern jazz piano cannot be underestimated. Probably the main influences that he brought to his style came from Bud Powell, Horace Silver, Lenny Tristano, and George Shearing, and also Milt Buckner in certain ways, especially with the locked hands chord technique, playing parallel chords in both hands with the melody on top. However, Bill Evans' own way of voicing chords and his own way of building improvised lines was totally original, and his style helped pave the way for pianists like Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea, and Keith Jarrett, and countless others. Perhaps the most startling innovation that Bill Evans brought to the table, and it really was a group innovation, essentially. It was his approach to the classic jazz piano, bass, and drums trio setting before the Bill Evans trio. Bass and drums essentially were timekeepers, providing a steady support for whatever the piano was doing. But with the trio that Bill Evans had with bassist Scott LaFaro and drummer Paul Modian, each instrument became an equal partner. You had continuous conversation, where a bass line did not have to keep a steady walking pattern, but could break away instead from that and respond to piano lines with lines of its own. And the same went for the drums, so that the beat was more implied than stated. And this created a very mobile and flexible and fluid ensemble texture, like improvised chamber music. And this kind of rhythm section concept began to manifest itself in the various Miles Davis ensembles of the 1960s. But for this episode, I'm going to be talking about Bill Evans as a solo pianist, as well as a pianist who used multi-tracking to record what he called conversations with myself. In January 1963, he recorded an album called Conversations with Myself, which consisted of multi-track selections involving 3 separate piano tracks. Actually, one selection, Blue Monk, just had 2 piano tracks, but the rest had 3 piano tracks. And the rhythmic subtleties that characterized his piano, bass, and drums trio emerge on 3 pianos with marvelous creative interplay throughout this album. And what's amazing to me still is that no matter how thick the textures can get, nothing ever sounds cluttered. In 1967, Bill Evans recorded an album called Further Conversations with Myself, which only involved 2 double-tracked pianos. And it's a beautiful album in many ways. Maybe it's not rhythmically as interesting as the 3 piano things from 1963. And then in 1978, Bill Evans recorded an album called New Conversations, where he mixes and matches going between 2 and 3 acoustic pianos, although actually one of the pianos is a Fender Rhodes electric piano. So sometimes you have 2 acoustics and 1 electric, or 1 acoustic with 1 electric, or you'll have 2 acoustic pianos. And then he has 1 solo track, which is a gorgeous interpretation of Duke Ellington's song Reflections in D. And I personally find the sound of the electric piano, the Fender Rhodes piano, a little bit dated. But I think that Bill Evans plans his textures and structures his arrangements perhaps with less casualness than before and with more care. And I can understand why he was especially proud of this album. Bill Evans also recorded 2 solo piano albums. The best known of the 2 is his 1968 release titled Alone. And the way that he puts these 5 songs together almost feels like a suite in terms of what the song selections are, as well as his choice of keys. So the songs on side 1, we're thinking about the LP format, are Here's That Rainy Day, A Time for Love, Midnight Mood, and On a Clear Day You Can See Forever. And the second side is just one song. It's an extended improvisation on the song Never Let Me Go. It lasts about 15 minutes. And the playing goes between subtle introspection and unfettered linear improvisation, and the mood is both exploratory and controlled at the same time. In 1975, Bill recorded an album called Alone Again. I find this release less persuasive, although it's more spontaneous and much looser in regard to how Bill just dives into playing one improvised chorus after another on The Touch of Your Lips, In Your Own Sweet Way, Make Someone Happy, and What Kind of Fool Am I? But then he plays the song People, you know, that song by Sammy Cahn and Julie Stein from the musical Funny Girl that Barbra Streisand made famous. You know, people who need people. Forgive my singing. And basically, Bill just plays the melody over and over and over again. First he plays it in the key of B flat, and then he plays it in the key of E major, and then he goes back to B flat, and then he goes back to E major, and he just does this over and over and over again. And he doesn't improvise at all. It's basically just stating the melody, and he changes the harmonizations a little bit, not too much, and the nuances of phrasing, but perhaps it's too much of a good thing. I've put links in this episode description where one can get to these Bill Evans recordings, as well as links to particular tracks that I especially love, such as the theme from Spartacus, from Conversations with Myself. And I've also placed a link to an article that I wrote about my working relationship with Bill Evans. He arranged that I could be both the editor and transcriber for a book of his piano solos, where I transcribed the music directly from the recordings. I did not know Bill Evans very well, I have to admit, but we did have one long telephone working session on the book, and we would always talk whenever I'd go hear him play at the Village Vanguard, and he even drove me home once to my apartment years and years ago. And apropos to what we usually talk about on the Piano Maven, Bill Evans had a thorough knowledge of the standard repertoire. You know, he was totally classically trained. By all accounts, he was supposed to be an amazing sight reader. I never saw that firsthand, but everyone I know who witnessed Bill sight reading said that he could really play anything up to tempo, especially things like the Rachmaninoff preludes or anything of Bach or Bartok. I had a friend who attested to this, that he saw Bill sight read the first Boulez piano sonata. I'm not sure if my friend was telling the truth, but I would love that to be true. But in any case, in one of my conversations with Bill, I remember very vividly that we were talking about our mutual love of Rachmaninoff's own recordings as a pianist. And I remember when I had that big working telephone meeting with Bill, I was living in Queens in New York City. I was roommates with the late producer and musicologist Alan Evans, who already at that time was a serious scholar of historic piano recordings. And when I was living at Alan's apartment, that year, he would let me make tapes of his 78s. This was long before compact discs, and this was a time when historic piano reissues on LP were few and far between. So I had reels and reels of tape of people like Alfred Cortot and Ignaz Friedman, Benno Moiseiwicz, you name it, all the dead pianists. And when I was on the phone with Bill, when we were talking about Rachmaninoff, I couldn't help but rant about my obsession and my growing tape collection. And Bill happened to be aware of a lot of these pianists, and he said something like he had some of these recordings as a child, I think. Anyway, he was very open to my coming over to visit him in his apartment in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where I could bring over some of these tapes. But we never got around to setting up a date. The idea was that he was going to be touring in Japan, I think, in the fall of 1980. And then when he returned, I guess October, November, something like that, we'd get together. But what I did not realize was that his health was markedly deteriorating. And I didn't really notice this because Bill could put a very sober front up in public. But I do remember when I went to see him play at the nightclub Fat Tuesday on September 9th, 1980, I remember he looked really awful. His hair was long and shaggy. He looked thinner than usual. It looked like he hadn't slept in months. And what I did not know is that he was compulsively doing cocaine, which hastened his demise. He had a bleeding ulcer and he had double pneumonia, but the cocaine certainly wasn't helping. Still, he played fantastically, and he was even talking to the audience, which was something I never had experienced with him in a club setting. Usually when I heard him at the Vanguard, he would just play, and we would just have to guess what the songs were. Anyway, I could not approach Bill that night at Fat Tuesday because basically his manager, Helen Keane, was fending off fans. And I sensed she was doing that because Bill's health was much more fragile than the situation appeared to be. And he canceled the engagement after playing the following night, and then he died less than a week later on September 15th. It's so funny that my memories of hearing and interacting with Bill Evans remain so vivid all these years later. I guess I didn't really go into the nuts and bolts of details in terms of what makes these solo recordings and multi-tracked recordings so special. But you do have the links to listen, and at a certain point, I'll have to devote another episode to the evolution of Bill Evans' various trios and go into much greater detail, because I have a lot to say about this, because I've been living with his music for such a long time, and he's a musician that everyone should really get to know. I can tell you that just about every classical pianist I know reveres Bill Evans. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to us being together for the next episode.